ago, and I won't tell you how many because that would give you too many hints about how old I am, I got a thank you card from a former student. By any traditional criteria, this man was one of my failures. Absolutely. Left the institution after his sophomore year. No evidence that he actually went anywhere else to finish a degree. Clearly messed up the retention in my institution and the graduation rate in my institution, despite the fact that he was an honors student when he came in. But Jason was not a failure. He was, in fact, not even one of my failures, he was one of my successes. So it turns out that long about the first semester of his sophomore year, he had written a journal article, or journal entry, required by me in one of my annoying courses called Self and Society, about how it was a travesty that the education system was holding him back, and he wanted to change the world now, and he was tired of being told he had to do his degree first, and he was tired of being told he had to wait till his junior or senior year to study abroad, and he was tired of being told that he couldn't make a difference until after he got his degree, and he was tired of this and tired of that, and he was whining through the entire entry of the journal. To which I replied, so, who's stopping you? Get off your butt, go to the study abroad meeting that's happening next week. Nobody's going to tell you you can't go. Go. And so he went. And he studied abroad in Hong Kong the next semester. And he stayed in China. And he joined a nonprofit in China and changed lives. And then he followed that nonprofit to West Africa and changed more lives. But found that it was a disaster to really just stay within the boundaries of some of the kinds of things this nonprofit was doing. He thought he could do it better. So he founded a new nonprofit organization there that actually empowered the people of the region to make their place better. And that worked so well, he went to another country in West Africa and did it again. And then he realized he was meeting so many others that were just like him that wanted to change the world, and he knew how to help them do it. So he helped other people found nonprofits. And then he moved to Washington, D.C. and started an entire corporation called Changing the World 101, where he consulted with people and helped them build these kinds of nonprofits. So Jason wanted to thank me. Thank me for that one little annoying comment that I made, like, so what? Get off your butt and go do it. Why is this story important? Because you can't measure that. So if you think I'm going to show you how to measure every single thing you do to transform lives for your students, it's not going to happen. There are going to be things that you as faculty members here do, that you as part of the UTEP experience do for students, that are not going to show up on any assessment measure you ever could possibly create. Right? That's an important piece of the puzzle. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some really important things you can measure, and that if you find some really good measures, you can't actually figure out how to help your students. And that's really what this is about, is how do I, now that I've built my beautiful set of learning outcomes, what do I do with them? How do I make sure that the way I'm measuring them tells me useful information that I can make use of later on? What kinds of options are there for me? So that's what this is really about, is selecting the right means of assessment, figuring out how to measure things in a way that will give you information you can use. But I just wanted to start with that caution, because there are going to be some kinds of things you can't measure, and that's okay. So we'll start with some real basic glossary terms. You're going to hear this all over the assessment literature, and anytime you have to submit any kind of report to anybody at this institution or to an accreditor or to a regional accreditor, they're going to be asking you whether you have direct measures of assessment or indirect measures of assessment. What does that really mean? Direct is just looking at actual student performance on a learning task. Read the actual paper they produced in your class to figure out whether they can write well. Right? Indirect means asking students to reflect upon their learning changes. So do you think that this assignment actually gave you a better grasp of U.S. history? Right? What's your impression of that? So that's the difference between direct and indirect measures. Now people are going to tell you that it's always better to have a direct measure. It largely depends upon the particular kind of thing you're trying to measure. If you're trying to measure, did the students who completed the midterm project actually show improvement on their final project? You're going to have to look at the project. So the direct measure is the best way to go. But it might be important for you to actually know, did the students who completed the midterm project feel more confident in their abilities? Right? You might need to know that because it might be the case that those students are going to go out into the community and try to share knowledge, and if they're coming out of that feeling unsure and not confident, that's not going to help them. Right? So what do you need to know? That's going to really determine whether you use a direct or an indirect measure. We're going to talk about the benefits, advantages, disadvantages of each of these types of measures and some examples of them. But just the overall picture there. So examples of a direct measure, probably one of the most common ones, and the ones that people will tell you are the ultimate best ways to actually look at assessment, are pre-test, post-test measures. Right? How were they when they came in versus how they are when they go out? Whether or not you want to choose a pre-test, post-test depends upon the information that you need. Do you need information about where they are when they first started? How were they? And that's what we call formative information. Where are they now in their formative stages? Do you need just information about the summative? Like, by the time they graduate, have they gotten it yet? Right? And again, this depends upon the purpose. If you're just sending information to an accreditor, maybe all they really want is your data about where students are when they graduate. Have they figured out how to write by that time? Right? But for you personally, it might be important for you to know, well, where were they in their first year composition course versus where were they in their junior year writing the discipline class? Maybe you need to see that. Right? One thing I want to caution you is that if you are reading literature about assessment, you will see formative and summative used in two different ways. All right. You will see formative used to describe students who are in the formative stages of their education, like early, and summative to describe students at the point at which they are graduating, right? Which seems kind of like the most common way to do it. But you will also find formative used to describe any assessment data that is used to actually improve your program or your processes. By that definition, all of your assessment data should be formative. It should be something that you use to figure out whether or not you can improve upon your program or your processes, right? And sometimes people will use summative just to say, well, this is just like the reporting data. This is the end point, and you don't use it for anything other than just to report, right? And by that definition, I would say, why are you measuring it? right? If it's only just for a report, I mean, maybe you have to, fine, measure it, report it to somebody, put it on a shelf. But I would prefer, and I think it would be better for all of you, if you actually used all of it in a formative way. So when you're looking at assessment literature and they're talking formative, summative, figure out first from the context whether they're talking about just students at their formative stages versus students at the point of graduation, in which case I think that's a perfectly logical comparison to make, or that they're talking about using your assessment data in a formative way. That's another way of doing it. Other things that we do as direct methods, quizzes, achievement tests, final exams, right? Frankly, I think if you're going to use a quiz or an achievement test to measure something, content knowledge for example, right, which is important in a lot of fields, right? It's really best if that is something that's embedded. So we did have a department here, and I'm sure more than one, that was using a quiz external to any of the courses, that they would just have students volunteer to come in and take this 10-question quiz to figure out where they were on a number of learning outcomes. We won't even talk about how a 10-question quiz can actually tell you anything about multiple learning outcomes. But the real problem for me is that where is the motivation for the students in completing this quiz successfully? Why should they care? So what was happening is that this particular program was underrepresenting the actual impact they had on their students. The quiz scores were abysmal, which reflected poorly upon them. But in fact, their students were far better than that. It's just that they didn't really have any particular reason to fill out this quiz. It wasn't going into any of their grades. It wasn't impacting them in any way, so who cares? So I recommend, if you're going to be using any kind of a quiz or an achievement test or a final exam or a midterm exam or anything as something that will be a pivotal piece of your program learning outcomes, which you can do, you definitely want to make sure that it is something that students care about, that's embedded actually in the real work they do, right? Because it needs to be something that they at least attempt to put their best efforts into. The point of assessment is not to figure out what are your students capable of at this very moment in time. The point is to really figure out what are your students capable of doing when they are doing their best. Of course, nationally normed standardized tests like the CLA are not bad things, right? They give benchmarks, and it's really good to have benchmarks, because even if students are not perfectly motivated to do these nationally normed tests outside of their particular coursework, that's true for all the students taking the test at every institution. So if what you're doing is just comparing your scores to another institution's set, or a set of institutions' scores, they're all suffering from the same motivational issues that your students are. So at least you can get a sense of how you compare to some set of peers, right? There are a lot of things, though, that doing out, I think it kind of depends upon the type of thing you're measuring, whether doing it outside of the classroom matters or not, right? Finally, of course, at sort of the gold standard of direct methods is review of student work that's been submitted to you in the form of papers, projects, videos, presentations, art portfolios, juried music performances, right? All of those kinds of things. That's the gold standard. How do you decide which of these things to use? Well, let's step back for a moment. You use all these things. You already use all these things. You do all these things. The elephant in the room, right? Grades. So why can't I just tell you my grades? That should be it. That should solve the problem, right? Maybe. I would argue that something like a course grade probably is not aligned with any of your learning outcomes. It might be aligned with 10 different learning outcomes. I don't know about you, but I sometimes grade people based upon whether or not they actually turn the assignment in on time. That's also another piece of the puzzle. So sometimes the best piece of writing I've ever seen got a B because it came to me 5 days late. Right? So there are different ways in which grades can work, but only if the grade is really truly aligned with the learning outcome. So I once gave a C to a student in his capstone course, but that did not really reflect anything about how he did on particular learning outcomes. His written work was C-ish. His oral presentation skills were remarkable. They were stellar. They were amazing. They were out of the park. He presented his research project. Everyone thought it was the most brilliant thing they'd ever seen. Based on that alone, everybody thought they should give him an A. Only I knew that the research project that he was reporting about was tragically flawed, poorly designed, horribly executed, and mostly bogus. Right? And so, for many of those reasons, he had some very low scores throughout the semester. Right? But dang, it was convincing. If I'm looking at the learning outcome for oral communication in my department, he should be rated at the top. He should be at the exemplary. That should be there. Everyone should know that. Somehow, we did a brilliant job of teaching that part. The ethical stuff, not so much, you know. But so, why can't we use grades? I think the quick answer is, if you're using course grades, they're almost never aligned. If you're using individual assignment grades, maybe you can. Maybe. If your grade truly is based upon the skill level for the particular outcome, then probably so. So those are there really are situations where I would say, you know what, that makes sense. It's particularly true if the course is something like, say, an internship or practicum course, and the grade on that course really truly is based upon evaluation of a student's skills in that clinical experience, right? Of course you could use the grade. The grade is based on that set of outcomes, right? But a lot of courses are not built that way. So that's why grades are not necessarily seen as best practices. So if I'm looking at student work, what do I do with it? Why can't I just give you the grade for the paper and say that represents his writing ability? And I would say there are a couple reasons for that. One of them is the one I talked about before. Your grade on this paper might represent that student's writing ability, but it also might represent their mastery of the content, their participation in the multiple draft process that you acquired, their turning things in efficiently on deadlines, and on the writing, right? So we don't know for sure whether your grade is just on the writing or on all of those things. But the other reason is that if you're really going to use this in a high-stakes thing like the outcomes for your program learning outcomes, right, you really ought to have multiple reviewers. And that's where rubrics come in mighty handy. So you have a couple of people who can agree upon a set of standards and say they're going to review it on that basis. We're going to start by talking about a simple type of rubric, what we call a holistic rubric. This is a holistic rubric. Very simple. Anytime the learning outcome that you're trying to measure, all you need is a single score. How are people right now? Using a holistic rubric is a good choice. Any situation where the outcome can be evaluated as one single holistic product, where all you need is a single score or rating. And the less complex the outcome, the more likely that is. Or if it's not as high a stakes outcome and you're really just kind of trying to get a sense of where students are, right? A holistic rubric is perfectly fine. What I'm handing out here is the holistic rubric that we use at this institution for teamwork, for evaluating teamwork as one of the core objectives of the state core curriculum. So instructors rate participation in a group project, essentially, with this rubric, and project out a single score. And so for the purposes of the larger institutional product, all we really need is for people to give us that single score, 0, 1, 2, 3, for their students, so we can get a sense of where people are in the university. But you may be looking at that going, you know, what if it turns out the students are kind of good at some aspects of teamwork and kind of not good at other aspects of teamwork? Teamwork's a little more complex than that. Well, I'm going to actually go back to that in a minute. What you might want is something a little bit different, and we call that an analytic rubric. So here's the exact same rubric that you're looking at for the exact same type of thing, only we had to kind of enhance it a little bit and break it down into different dimensions. Analytic rubrics are best when you have a complex, compound kind of outcome that you're looking at. Critical thinking, common one, right? That has multiple dimensions. In this case, you can actually score each of these dimensions separately. Well, they're good at the leadership aspect of this, but they really weren't good at the cooperation aspect of this. They can lead a team, but they really are not good at just being participants in a team, right? Scores then can actually, you can still concatenate your scores into an overall thing if you need to report it upward that way. But the benefit of having something broken down in an analytic example is that if you do have a set of scores that are below what your expectations are, you know, wow, we really thought our students would be at a 3 or better now, but they're not really there, right? You can go deeper into it and figure out why. Oh, I see what's happening here. People are really good at this part of it, but they're not doing their work in sort of valuing others. That dimension, whoops, we need to talk about that. Right? So a lot of times, if you really need to be able to diagnose a problem, I recommend analytic rubrics because they break things down into littler pieces. If you're really pretty sure students are getting it and you just want to see how many of them are getting it, a holistic rubric is perfectly fine. And I would recommend that if this is something you haven't yet ever measured before and you're not really sure where you're going with it, start with a holistic rubric so that you just have a baseline to go to. And then, if it turns out there is a problem, then the next time you measure that same thing, use a more analytic one so you can break down, like, so where is the problem, right? But if you already know there's a problem, students in my discipline just can't write, right? Then you're going to want to use an analytic kind of rubric from the get-go so you can figure out where is that breakdown. Right. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to think about your own program learning outcomes right now. Pick one in your head. Think about how complex it is, how many pieces it might or might not have. Think about what kind of student work usually your students would produce that they could use to show you whether or not they are exhibiting that outcome. And then think, would this be best if I looked at it with a holistic outcome or an analytic outcome? Does somebody want to just throw an outcome out there that you're thinking of from your program? And we can sort of think about it together.
Complex one?
Any outcome that you want to, that you're thinking, oh, how will I measure this? What do you think?
I have one right in front of me.
Okay, you got one in front of you, go for it.
So students will be able to situate themselves within current rhetorical theories, demonstrate appropriate disciplinary knowledge, and be able to conduct research effectively in a particular rhetorical context.
Wow. That's a heck of an outcome.
It's complex.
What do we think about that one? We think holistic, we think analytic. Okay, this is really a softball question. I think I would go for an analytic rubric, right? There's more than one dimension there that we want to look at, right? The nice thing is the way it's written, you could probably figure out exactly what those dimensions are, right? Okay, appropriate rhetorical context. Next, appropriate research. Next, right? Right? You could probably create a nice analytic rubric that would go to each of those things. All right. Other things people ask me about when they look at these analytic rubrics is sort of like, well, how do you decide whether you have, 4 different levels or 3 different levels or 2 different levels? My answer to that is it's up to you. What is it you need to know? Right? At the early stages, I would say when you're just sort of trying to use something where you're trying to figure out where students are right now, let's say in their first year, second year, that kind of thing, you might just need to know the basics. Are they at the acceptable or unacceptable, or somewhere in between? 3 levels is enough for that. That's good, that gives you a sense, right? But if you really need to be able to differentiate the awesome from the ones who got it and are going to make it through, right? Then you'll need probably at least those 4 levels, right? You can make it more. I mean, obviously, people think in terms of A, B, C, D, F. They think in terms of 5 levels. This is one of the reasons why I generally recommend people not create a 5-level rubric, because then what you will get is a reproduction of grades instead of a thoughtful consideration of, does this person belong in this category or this category according to the rubric? Because people just sort of, faculty think in grades. I mean, you're kind of trained that way over time. Oh, that's a B paper, right? But if you have to sit down and think, I gave this a B, but that doesn't matter. Is this in the acceptable category or in the exemplary category based upon the lists in this rubric? You have to think about it a little more if it's not in the same breakdown that you started with. So I generally recommend to avoid using 5, just so you can avoid reiterating grades. But I do think that in a lot of cases people are overdoing it. They're rating something on a scale of 1 to 10 every time, when in reality, what you really just need to know is how many of your students have gotten over the threshold of understanding the basic concept and how many haven't, right? So that depends upon what information you need. All right. So that one that she described should clearly be done with an analytic rubric, I would have to say. Can anybody think of one that they would be willing to evaluate with just a holistic rubric?
If we stick to smaller numbers, not the scale of 10, but go to a scale of 3 or 5, does that actually help the students as well? I mean, it would actually help us, right? Because we don't have to create the whole rubric and this matrix of.
It depends. I mean, if you are using a rubric to create your grades, that's a different level of using a rubric. The way I'm talking about using the rubric is to evaluate something for the purpose of determining how many students in your department have reached the threshold in writing or critical thinking or whatever your outcome is. And for that purpose, reiterating grades is not that important. Now, when it comes down to whether or not you're going to use a rubric within your course to guide a student, I think that kind of depends upon the nature of the task. I would say in most cases, giving people 10 categories or 10 levels is a bit overwhelming. When you're using a rubric, in a course as part of the way you actually assign grades, that's a different step. And I would say in those cases, you definitely want the students to see the rubric in advance so that they know what the criteria are upon which they are being graded. And I would have the rubric, in that case, I would have the rubric actually match your grading scale. Whatever your grading scale is, have it match.
Actually, I don't,
Okay.
but it's, I teach a university class.
Mhm.
And one of the rubrics is every week, once a week, we have them answer 3 questions. And one of the questions is, I showed up to class on time, every time, since the last time we
Yeah.
did this. And I never look at it. I glance, and just make sure I ask them to give themselves a 0 if they didn't do it, or a 1 if they did.
Oh, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, there are a lot of things where yes and no are fine. And when we get to indirect measures, you'll see this whole thing changes. This whole
Okay.
category changes, absolutely. Yeah, you had I saw another hand up, yeah.
Oh, this is, as an example, I've done some, science fair grading,
Uh-huh,
and at that point, they give us a rubric, so that everybody's grading the same. But only, and it's like 1 to 10 or something. But only the odd numbers have an assigned definition of what that is. The even numbers are just blank. And so then you're sitting there, well, if I wanted, what would be the difference of a 6 versus a 7, because it's undefined. Just as an example of one of those that goes overboard as far as
yeah,
too many categories.
absolutely. Although they probably did that because they got, when they had it in 5, they had so many people that were giving 2.5s. And because they refuse to put somebody in a category. You know, that's the sort of thing that people do because they don't want to make that decision.
Or vice versa.
Right. I would say when you want to use a rubric, the first thing you need to do is you need to calibrate your raters on that rubric. So if you have 2 raters, 5 raters, however many, you need to give them some samples, and they need to agree of how they're going to interpret the rubric on those samples and get some. Well, there's actually one of my workshops eventually talks about how to calibrate on that. What AAC&U recommends for using value rubrics is when they say when you start by looking at a paper, always start at the top end. Assume it's a 4. And then start looking through, and if it's missing some of the elements that are listed in the 4, that's when you move down to the 3. And then if it's missing some of those elements, that's when you move down to the 2. That they recommend that kind of process, because that's the best way to make sure that you kind of stay together and pay attention to the elements. But that's another workshop altogether, how to calibrate.
I have a quick question. So you have definition for acceptable, exemplary, for developing its meets criteria but needs help, or?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, those categories means that they've sort of started down the path. Developing is what you would expect from somebody who's taken one class in that area. So they've got the basic principle, but they haven't really figured out how to apply it, they're getting there, right? But those labels across the top, those labels are just labels that we chose. Okay. So you can label you can keep it 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can keep it 0, 1, 2, 3. That's completely irrelevant. What you want is to have some kind of idea of what it means. We called that developing because when we looked down at the list of those criteria, it seemed like that represents somebody who's just starting to develop those teamwork skills, right? What I've got here, and you'll be able to have a copy of the slides. So these links take you to some sample rubrics from all over. So you don't have to start on your own and build your own rubric. If you've already got one, that's awesome. But if you're at a loss, you can go to, and these are the ones I recommend most highly, the AAC&U value rubrics. Value stands for Valid Assessment of Learning in Undergraduate Education. These have actually already been tested at many, many universities. They're also public domain, and you're allowed to modify them however you wish. So you could just take 2 of the 5 dimensions, or you could just take 3 of the 4 levels, or you could do whatever you want. So they're really good. Association for Assessment of Learning in Higher Education, this particular link will just take you to a repository of links to rubrics from institutions all over. Big institutions, small institutions, private, public, and some of them are very specific, chemistry research analysis and those kinds of things. So and some of them are more broad, like just critical thinking in general. So this is just a repository of all kinds, without any kind of evaluation of how good they are, but they're good starts. And then NILOA has like a library of published materials that incorporates rubrics, and those all have research attached to them. So, and then the other thing is sort of also ask around. If your department is really struggling with how to do a critical thinking rubric, guarantee that there's other departments who have found a pathway that works for them here at the institution. So talk to your colleagues. Now there are other kinds of direct methods though. Rubrics and tests aren't the only kinds. We also have the possibility of using observational checklists. In these kinds of situations, or in certain kinds of situations, this is what you really need. What if you are working in a chemistry lab and you're trying to figure out whether your students can successfully use a pipette, right? What you need is to have somebody walking around checklisting that they're following the protocol, all right? If this is critically important, and certainly in a lot of clinical skills kinds of courses, it's critically important, then an observational checklist is really a good choice. Clinical fieldwork, laboratory skills. This also works in mock job interviews. I'm going to give you some examples of checklists here. We have a checklist that people use for the etiquette dinner that UTEP has every year, right? Did they place the napkin folded in their lap? Did they keep their elbows off the table? Right? Did they use the right fork? Those are checklists, right? So you'll see that the dinner etiquette checklist is on one side. On the other side is a much more elaborate set of checklists. That's a checklist that was used by my former department at Stetson University. And it was used more, not as it happens, but the professor would reflect back about the students carrying out the research project. We were trying to get a sense of whether students were capable of doing the data collection process and doing the data analysis process without too much hand-holding. And that was like, before we just had a very vague idea of what that meant. And then we sat down and we just built a checklist, right? And that's a pretty straightforward checklist. So, and it really answers the question, how much hand-holding did they need? And was it the appropriate amount, right? So you can use observational checklists for reflecting back on behavior, but checklists in general are for behavior, right? And so, if that's what you're testing, like a lot of our folks in the health sciences, right, they're going to have they're going to need to use checklist approaches for certain kinds of things, right? But you can do that for a lot of different things if it's a critically important thing for you to do. Now, what about indirect methods? There's obviously a lot of kinds of situations where you really need to use indirect methods. If your learning outcome talks about people changing their attitudes, if it talks about them changing their feelings, having different impressions, if it asks for opinions, I mean, anytime you want to measure those kinds of things, the only way you can do is ask, right? Also, if you want to actually look at past behaviors that you couldn't possibly have observed, then you need surveys, right? It has to be an indirect measure. If you want to look at their intentions for the future, or future directions, or plans for their behavior, will you be going to graduate school? Right? You'll need an indirect measure. So surveys are great for that. So if your learning outcomes actually include things like students will become aware of X, or students will appreciate X, right? Those are things that are in somebody's head somewhere. There's no little red flashing light that goes on over their head when it happens. They have to tell you it's happening somehow, right? Why would you use interviews instead of surveys? Well, you'd use it for the same kinds of outcomes, but if you need deeper answers, you need to probe a little bit further. You don't want just yes, no, maybe. You want a little bit more information. Interviews sometimes are very helpful. You can get a wider range of answers that way. You can also follow up on any interesting directions, right? So you're consistently finding out that students aren't getting a greater appreciation, but maybe even a lesser appreciation for something. You might want to ask more questions. Okay, why is it that now you suddenly hate going to museums when beforehand, right? Interviews, however, are harder to code for analysis later. I mean, I will admit that. So I'm not going to say interviews are always superior. If you're really trying to gather a lot of data quickly, that it's a lot harder to code them for analysis. So you do have to have some kind of idea of how you're going to organize your data if you're doing interviews. But in some cases, this is a good choice. A lot of our programs do exit interviews, particularly for their graduate students, to get a sense of various professional preparation kinds of issues. Okay? So if you're going to do a survey, I highly recommend you work with somebody who understands surveys instead of creating it yourself. All right? Especially if you're going to use closed-ended questions. So I'm going to start off with this one. I want you don't tell me. Just think where your answer would fall on this scale. When I look at this, I get alarmed.
Not applicable.
I get alarmed, yeah, for two reasons. What if I don't drink at all? I'm not on here.
Right.
And also, what if I have, like 1 glass of wine at dinner each night? I'm suddenly in the 3 out of 4 category? Now I'm worried, right? Whereas I could do this. And now if I have 1 drink of wine with dinner each night, or if I don't drink at all, both of us are in this category. Right? And I'm sorry, more than 5 a day. We're going to be calling the hospital up right here, right? Every day. Really? But you can see you can really, really manipulate data if you don't understand how surveys work. So you do have to be sure, if you're going to build a survey, that you work with somebody that understands surveys. Open-ended questions don't have quite as many problems, but they're harder to code. Something simple like, what is your religious affiliation? Or sometimes you might use it partially open-ended. So you actually have some categories, the ones you know that are the most common maybe, and then leave the rest open to debate. Right? Now, it depends upon your point here. If what you're looking for is to get some really interesting answers, the first one might be better. Because you never know what people might say if you leave it completely open. Right? But if you really are just trying to categorize people for some very specific purpose, then, start off with some basics and then leave it open. Most demographic questionnaires are partially open-ended like that. Right? You can also use Likert scales. That checklist that I had actually incorporated a Likert scale into the checklist. Likert scales are anything where you're asking people to give you an answer on a range of strongly disagree to agree on a set of questions, right? You can use those as surveys, you can use those with interviews. They have some statistical advantages because if you create them correctly, you can actually combine across multiple items for a single score, but you have to be careful how you design them because they are not actually appropriate scale. They're not perfectly interval scales and they're not ratio scales. So you can't really add, subtract, multiply, divide the way you would want to. But it gives you a general idea, all right? And this is kind of what we use for our student evaluations of teaching / student opinion polls that we use, right? Is a Likert type of scale. Focus groups is another thing that you might use. That's particularly helpful if you need to know not only what's going on, but why. If you need to know the reasons that your participants have a particular set of beliefs and attitudes and experiences, it's really a particular kind of interview process where you bring multiple people in the room at a time. And not only do the participants have an opportunity to tell you why they think what they think, but they also have the opportunity to react to each other's ideas. And this is beneficial because sometimes that can provide some consensus about the degree to which the outcomes that you're looking at were really met. It might be the case that having a focus group actually allows them to interact about a particular social issue, to sort of digest and debate the ethical concerns underlying it, and come to some consensus about what the right answer should be or what elements go into that answer. And that might tell you more about whether your students are learning ethical reasoning than just if you're talking to them one-on-one or giving a survey. It's also beneficial if you're trying to explore multiple things at a time. Right? So a sample focus group questions, you almost always want to start with a warm-up. So this is one about advising. I'd like everyone to start first by just saying a word or two that best describes your advising experience at UTEP. You know, get everybody talking first. Oh, it was terrible. Oh, it was this. Oh. Then you drill down. All right? Well, tell us about the Advising Center. What did you find most useful? What would you like them to do differently? What specific issues were addressed or not addressed by your professional advisors, by the peer advisors? Then you can actually go even further. What about faculty advising? What did you find most useful in your meetings with your faculty advisor? What would you like us to do differently? You know, what should be changed to better prepare you for the future, etc.? Those are things you can. Here we're dealing with multiple issues, so a focus group is a really good way to do that. It's also a good way to sort of find out if the person that's like constantly giving zeros on the student evaluation sheet is an outlier or if his concerns are shared by everybody else, right? That's really a helpful thing in a focus group. So now I'm going to ask you guys to help me figure out what kind of method I might want to use for particular learning outcomes. Students will show increased appreciation of diverse cultures after taking this course. We won't talk about whether that's a good learning outcome or not. That's just it is my learning outcome, so we have to live with it. All right. How are we going to measure that? What do you want to do to measure that? Indirect, I agree. That's indirect because appreciation. I don't know how do you see appreciation in a direct way, right? All right. So we definitely want an indirect measure. I mean, we could do a survey. I'd probably do an interview or a focus group just to get a little more. Depends upon what I'm. But yeah, this is definitely an indirect measure, right? How about students will recognize the difference between a correlational and an experimental design and identify which is appropriate to their research question? Yeah, definitely direct. What kind of direct measure would you use? A quiz, right? You wouldn't need a rubric for that. Just put it on an exam. You could build an exam question that would answer all of that, right?
If we don't have exams though, we could also do whatever their final paper is or their dissertation or whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Demonstrate
Yeah,
that
you
they-
could look at a research paper and see that, right? Or at least you could see the last part, figure out which one's appropriate to their research question. Depends upon whether. But yeah, that one's a straightforward one. You could have 1 or 2 exam questions and figure that out. Students will create an effective research proposal that could be executed and could lead to potentially useful data. This one actually comes from one of our programs.
So you had a rubric evaluating their research proposal.
Yeah, exactly. You would want to look at the research proposal. That was a big hint, right? I think I'm going to look at their research proposal to figure that out. Right? But I'd use a rubric. I'd probably use an analytic one because I need to know, could this be executed? And could it lead to potentially useful data? Those are separate questions, really. Because there are a lot of research things that you could do, but wouldn't give you any good information, right? And maybe the reverse would be true too, although I'd have to think about that. All right, what about this one? Students will be aware of the many opportunities for students graduating with their particular degree. Yeah, you gotta ask them, right? Awareness, and that is another big clue. Appreciation is one of those words. Awareness is another one of those. If you're asking for awareness, you're gonna have to ask. But you're not gonna see awareness in their heads, right? So, yep. Some kind of indirect method there. Probably a survey would be perfectly sufficient for that, right? Students will enhance their ethical awareness and leadership skills through involvement in departmental seminars and workshops. There are a lot of different, there's no perfect answer to this one. Me personally, since there's so many pieces of the puzzle, I might do a focus group. Because I'm gonna ask a lot of questions, right? But you could do pre-post if you had some ethical awareness questions. You could have a reflective paper, perhaps, and a rubric that looked at those things. But again, then how would you know whether it had something to do with their involvement in departmental seminars, right? So you'd have to include that somehow, right? This one is one where I almost think if you don't break them all together and talk to them, I don't know how you figure that out. Or you have to actually break this down into multiple things, right?
You could
But
also
this is-
look,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go
You
ahead.
could look at their CV for the leadership skills and
Ah.
involvement, but you don't know how ethical they're gonna, or their ethical awareness,
Yeah.
that's quite.
But that's actually a brilliant thing, right? You could ask them to write a personal statement and give you a CV, which is something that they might be doing to prepare for going out into the grand world. You might be able to then, between the personal statement and a CV, kind of get that sense. If you already knew whether they showed up at those, if you take attendance at the seminars and workshops, you already know that part, right? That would be an interesting way to do it. I like that idea. Students will work effectively in team settings with diverse groups of people. Okay, that's too easy because I handed you the rubric. But in fact, one thing I should let you know is that there are some institutions that have taken the value rubric that the ACNU developed for teamwork and turned it into an observational checklist. And so for teamwork, you can actually do a checklist kind of thing. So if what you're doing is wandering around and observing participation in groups, right? So there's not necessarily only one way you can do a thing, right? You can change it up. So does anybody in here have a thorny thing that they need to figure out how to measure?
Well,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna offer this.
Yeah.
Because I'm gonna go back to the first half of the discussion.
Yes.
And I just had a wonderful epiphany that I'll share, that I was thinking about. Now, how would I use a complex rubric to assess one of my existing assignments? And I ended up thinking about the learning outcomes that I wanted to kind of because you're disaggregating your outcomes with the different categories.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I ended up I reversed engineered it and ended up inventing a new assignment that supports the kinds of things I want to measure the learning outcome. And I can't wait to get back to my office and start working on it. So that really was a stimulus and a catalyst for thinking about assessment, but assessment as part embedded in instruction and thinking about instruction. That's what we're trying to do.
Absolutely.
So
I
that
think,
was just terrific.
thank you, thank you.
You're-
I think using an analytic rubric as a backwards engineering process for assignment design is actually a really important kind of thing to do with assessment. I mean, that's one of the things that has grown out of assessment work is the idea of how to create a signature assignment that really reverse engineer, that starts from reverse engineering the rubric. Well, we know these are the things we want students to do. Wait, if I tweak this assignment, this last thing in here becomes part of the assignment, right? That is the kind of thing that, and we call that building signature assignments, and it's a really, I think it's one of the most valuable things to come out of assessment, not the measurement itself, but once you sit down as faculty and you start discussing what are those things that go in that rubric, you start realizing, oh, I left that out of my assignment. I'm gonna fix that, right? I think that's a great thing. All right. Well, if anybody has any thorny things that you want me to diagnose, just let me know, because that's my favorite thing to do. Is that problem solving stuff? But I hope this is helpful. Be sure that when you get the copy of the presentation, you click on those links and go wandering around and look at all those rubrics that are actually available to you already. So you don't have to start by reinventing the wheel. But, all right. Thank you, everyone.